Six teenage boys vanished into the Pacific Ocean in June 1965, stealing a fishing boat and chasing what they thought was freedom. They had no map, almost no food, and zero real survival skills. Stranded on a deserted island where most people would have turned savage within weeks. But what actually happened out there will completely flip everything you think you know about human nature under extreme pressure. This is the true story that puts Lord of the Flies to shame. June 1965, Tonga Tapu Island. The boys were locked into the daily grind at St. Andrew's College, a strict Catholic boarding school where every hour was accounted for, every movement watched. Imagine being a teenager with all that energy, all that rebellion bubbling under your skin, and you're trapped in a place that feels more like a prison than a school. Sean Fatawa was the oldest at just 16, Stephen Fatai Latu, Kolo Fekitoa, Sean Filipi Tatau, Mano Tatau, and the youngest kid, David Tavitasola, barely 13 years old. These weren't troubled delinquents or hardened criminals. They were just regular boys from Hafeva, a small windswept island where hard work and salt air were part of everyday life. But boarding school had crushed them into a mold they didn't fit. Endless rules, suffocating discipline, mind-numbing lessons that felt like torture for kids who just wanted to breathe. Teenage resentment is like gasoline waiting for a match, and these six boys found their spark in a shared fantasy that grew more real with every whispered conversation. They'd slip away, steal a boat, sail across the ocean to Fiji, maybe even New Zealand if luck was on their side. The plan wasn't sophisticated. That's what made it so appealing. They weren't trying to be heroes in some epic adventure. They just wanted to taste freedom, even if it was reckless and completely irresponsible. And honestly, that's what made it feel so alive to them. The boat belonged to a local fisherman named Mr. Taniela Uhila, a guy known for his sour attitude and the kind of authority that made kids want to rebel just on principle. The boys didn't like him. It was simple, uncomplicated teenage defiance. So, on that fateful evening when their fantasy hardened into action, they borrowed his small fishing boat and quietly slipped out of the harbor as the sun dipped below the horizon. Nobody saw them leave. Nobody raised an alarm. Six boys just vanished into the open Pacific with nothing but 2 sacks of bananas, a handful of coconuts, and a portable gas burner. Provisions that only made sense if you thought the ocean was your neighborhood pool and the journey was just a fun weekend trip. No compass, nitrogen monoxide chart, no navigation equipment whatsoever. Their entire plan relied on luck, maybe some stars if they could figure out how to read them, and the completely naive assumption that the Pacific Ocean would just cooperate with 6 teenage runaways. At first, it seemed like maybe the universe was on their side. Clear skies, manageable waves, the electric thrill of doing something forbidden and irreversible coursing through their veins. The night air cooled their sun-warmed skin as the boat rocked in a hypnotic rhythm that lulled them, one by one, into sleep. That one small, ordinary, completely human decision nearly became their death sentence. The storm hit like a hammer, a massive squall rolled in with zero warning, and the ocean transformed from calm to catastrophic in minutes. The boys jerked awake to salt water smashing into their faces, wind screaming like something alive and furious, waves towering over their tiny boat like walls of liquid chaos. David, the youngest, would later joke that the older boys only brought him along because he was the only one who actually knew how to sail. But in that moment, knowledge meant nothing against nature's raw power. He fought with the sail, and the wind shredded it like tissue paper. Then the rudder snapped clean off. Just like that, they lost all control. The boat wasn't a vessel anymore. It was just floating wreckage with 6 terrified kids clinging to it. 8 days of drifting began, and there's a special kind of hell in being surrounded by water while slowly dying of thirst. Water everywhere, endless horizon in every direction, and not a single drop safe to drink. Their meager food supply vanished fast. Their mouths turned dry and cracked, tongues swelling, lips splitting open. Then they rationed it with a discipline that would have shocked their teachers back at school. One careful sip in the morning, one measured sip at night, no cheating, no exceptions. Fishing seemed like the obvious answer, but the reality was brutal. The gear they had was pathetic, barely functional. The ocean refused to give up easy meals. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, a dull ache that never stopped. Thirst turned into agony. Salt burned their skin. The sun beat down relentless and merciless. Nausea became their constant companion. Every muscle in their bodies cramped and ached from tension and dehydration. By day 8, when a dark shape finally appeared on the distant horizon, it looked like salvation itself. The island of Ata. But as they got closer, salvation started looking a lot more like a death trap. Ea Island is mostly steep mountains and brutal cliffs. Its coastline a jagged nightmare of sharp rocks and vertical drops that seemed designed to keep people out. Landing there wasn't going to be some gentle arrival on a sandy beach. It was going to be a violent collision with unforgiving geology. The boys drove what was left of their shattered boat straight onto the rocks because they had no other choice. The impact was devastating. The boat smashed apart completely. The boys got battered, cut up, bleeding from a dozen wounds. But they were alive, and right then, that was enough. It took them a day and a half just to fully get ashore, crawling over rocks, fighting through surf that kept trying to drag them back out. The ocean doesn't let go of people easily, even when it's done with them. When they finally collapsed on solid ground, too exhausted to feel anything except overwhelming relief, they found a cave and crawled inside for shelter. They slept hard, the kind of sleep that comes after your body has been pushed past every limit. But when they woke up, reality hit them like a second storm. They were stranded on a deserted island with zero supplies, zero tools, and zero idea how to survive in the wilderness. And nobody on Earth knew where they were. Ada carried history like an old scar that never quite healed. Long before these 6 boys crashed onto its shores, families had lived there. Real communities with gardens, chickens, children playing, normal village life, shaped by the rhythm of waves and seasons. Then violence came from the sea in the form of slave raiders who tore the population away, family by family, until the island was left empty and haunted. Ruins remained scattered across the landscape, along with a heavy silence that seemed to remember the screams. But the boys weren't thinking about ghost stories or tragic history. They were thinking about the immediate, urgent problem of not dying in the next few days. Sean and Stephen, the 2 oldest boys, naturally stepped into leadership roles. Though leadership on a deserted island isn't about being popular or charismatic. It's about staying calm when everyone else is panicking and making smart decisions when one wrong move could kill somebody. Sean was the practical one, always thinking about what needed to happen next. They prayed together every day, not because prayer would magically build them shelters or make food appear. These weren't Boy Scouts or seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. They'd grown up on Tongatapu, a relatively modern, populated island with shops, schools, electricity, and all the comforts of civilization. Everything they knew about survival came from stories or their imagination. The island didn't care about their inexperience. It didn't grade on a curve. It only cared whether they could adapt fast enough to stay alive. They found a small overhang of rock that provided some protection from the elements and arranged makeshift bedding underneath it. It wasn't comfortable by any definition, but it kept the rain off their heads and gave them a home base. Water became their most desperate obsession. Without fresh water, everything else was pointless. They'd die of dehydration long before hunger could finish them off. They started hollowing out tree trunks, creating crude collection systems where rainwater could slowly accumulate in the cavities. Improvised cisterns that took days to yield even small amounts of drinkable water. Coconuts helped provide some fluid, but nowhere near enough to sustain 6 growing boys who were burning calories just trying to survive. Desperation makes people do things they never imagined possible. The boys began climbing the treacherous cliffs to catch seabirds, not just for the meat, but for the blood. When water was scarce, they'd drink the blood straight from the birds to stay hydrated. Without any way to make fire, they ate the meat raw, tearing into it with their hands and teeth like animals. There's no way to romanticize this part of the story. It was grim, primal, and absolutely necessary. Fire became their obsession, consuming their thoughts and driving their daily efforts. Every single day they attempted to create it using the most brutally simple method imaginable: friction. Wood against wood, rubbing and scraping until their hands blistered and bled, until thin wisps of smoke teased them with false hope, until sparks appeared for a split second and then died. Then they'd start all over again the next morning. Fire meant more than just warmth and the ability to cook their food. Fire was a signal that could be seen from miles away by any passing ship. Fire was proof they were still human, still fighting, not yet ghosts haunting an abandoned island. As weeks turned into months, they learned a crucial. One moment there was just wood dust, exhaustion, and bleeding hands. The next moment there was heat, actual light, the bright dancing movement of flame licking upward and catching hold. The boys absolutely erupted in happiness so intense it bordered on hysteria. They screamed, they cried, they hugged each other like they'd just won the lottery. They understood instantly and completely that this fire was now their most valuable possession on the entire island. They guarded it constantly with rotating shifts, fed it carefully, shielded it from wind and rain like protecting a fragile newborn baby. They built a small shelter of leaves and branches specifically to house the fire and moved it inside with extreme care. For the rest of their entire time on Ada, spanning over a year, they never let that fire die. Not once. Food required a structured, disciplined approach to keep their bodies functioning. They calculated they needed at least 2 seabirds per boy, per day, to provide enough meat and fluid to sustain them. Hunting on Ada is seriously dangerous work. The cliffs are steep, crumbling, and absolutely unforgiving. One wrong step, one loose rock, one moment of carelessness, and you're falling to your death on the rocks below. One day, Stephen, one of their leaders, slipped while hunting. He fell hard and landed on a narrow ledge jutting out from the cliff face, his leg broken badly in the impact. In the fictional story, in Lord of the Flies, this is exactly where the injured become burdens, where the strong abandon the weak to die alone. On Ata, the real boys did the complete opposite. They searched frantically until they found him on that ledge. They carefully climbed down and carried him back to camp with the desperate determination of people who understand they cannot afford to lose a single member of their group. They set his bone as best they could with zero medical training, splinting it with branches and binding it tight into place with whatever materials they could find. Then, without a single complaint, they absorbed his entire workload while he healed. For months, Stephen rested and slowly recovered while the other 5 hunted, tended the fire, carried water, gathered food, did all the grinding, exhausting labor of keeping 6 people alive. When Stephen finally stood again and walked on that leg, it was a victory the entire group owned together. They'd kept him alive through care, patience, and selfless teamwork. The island held surprises they never expected. As they explored further and pushed toward the summit of one of the flat-topped mountains, they discovered ruins from the old abandoned settlement. There they found plants that could be cultivated for food, including yucca and other vegetables that were still growing wild. And most astonishingly, they found chickens. Living, breathing, clucking chickens that were descendants of birds left behind when the original villagers were taken away generations ago. The chickens had survived and multiplied into a thriving feral population scattered across the mountaintop. The boys began catching the chickens at night, turning it into a competitive game to keep their spirits from collapsing under the crushing weight of routine. Eventually, they managed to pen up about 200 chickens in an enclosure they built. The birds gave them eggs, a reliable, renewable source of protein that didn't require risking their lives on those deadly cliffs every single day. They tried hard to preserve the flock as a resource, only killing and eating a chicken when the weather made seabird hunting too dangerous or impossible. They learned to think systematically, planning not just for today's meal, but for next week, next month, thinking long-term in a way that showed incredible maturity for teenage boys. At some point, driven by desperation and hope, they built a raft and attempted to escape the island. The plan made sense in the thin, fragile logic of people who needed to believe freedom was possible. Anything would be better than just waiting to die on Ada, but they still had no compass, no map, no real understanding of ocean currents or navigation. The raft fell apart about a mile offshore, breaking into pieces and dumping them into the ocean. They swam back to the island, completely exhausted and deeply humbled by the experience. That failed escape attempt might have actually saved their lives, because the same ocean that had nearly killed them once was still out there waiting, indifferent and deadly. By the time a full year had passed, hope had fundamentally changed its texture and flavor. It wasn't bright and urgent anymore. That desperate belief that rescue was just around the corner. It had become quieter, more resigned, more realistic. They began acting like people who genuinely believed they might spend the rest of their lives on Ada. They built more permanent, sturdy shelters designed to last years. They revived the old gardens they'd found near the ruins, planting and cultivating crops with real care. They divided all chores and tasks into pairs, always working in pairs so no one was ever isolated for long and no one had to carry a burden completely alone. They kept strict schedules like they were still in school because structure prevents the slow slide into despair and madness. They exercised together every single day, fully aware that laziness and physical decline were a form of slow surrender to the island. They even carved out a badminton court and held regular tournaments. As if the rules of a game could impose order and normalcy on a world that had become largely ruleless and chaotic. During one exploration of the ruins, they found human bones, the remains of an old man, perhaps one of the last original inhabitants who lingered on Ada after everyone else had been taken by slavers or fled in terror. The boys carefully gathered the bones and gave this unknown man a proper burial and a full funeral service, praying for his soul and for their own. Even in complete exile from civilization, they insisted on maintaining human dignity and respect. Meanwhile, beyond Ada's cliffs, life continued its normal course. Ships occasionally passed within sight of the island, completely indifferent to the 6 boys fighting for survival on its shores. Back on Tonga, families mourned their lost sons. The boys were officially presumed dead after weeks of fruitless searching. Funerals were held, grief rituals were performed. Parents wept over empty graves. That's what communities do when there's nothing left to do but accept loss and try to move forward. In September 1966, more than 15 months after the boys disappeared, A man named Peter Warner was at sea aboard his boat called the Kalia. Warner was young, ambitious, and determined to build a life that did and fit neatly into his wealthy family's expectations for him. He'd been making his living as a fisherman and was returning from a business trip to Tonga when the Kalia approached Ada. One of Warner's crew members thought he heard a human voice carrying across the water. Warner initially dismissed it as just seabirds making noise, but something made him agree to take a closer look. In these remote Pacific islands, fires don't just start by accident. Those marks suggested deliberate human activity. They suggested people were living there. Warner kept his distance at first, cautious and wary. He'd heard plenty of rumors about escaped convicts and dangerous criminals being marooned on remote islands. Stories specifically designed to keep sailors from getting too curious or helpful. Then suddenly, without warning, 6 figures appeared at the top of the cliff and plunged into the water below, swimming toward the ship with frantic, desperate purpose. Their hair was long and wild, grown out over months without scissors. Their clothes were completely gone, worn away by time, salt, sun, and the sheer impracticality of fabric in that brutal environment. They must have looked absolutely wild, like something out of a survival nightmare. But there was nothing savage or feral in their behavior, only desperate urgency and overwhelming hope. They reached the ship and called out to Warner in clear, fluent English. They weren't entirely sure exactly how long because time had become strange and unmeasured on the island, but they'd been keeping count on a slate stone back at their camp, marking off the days. The precision after such extended chaos and trauma is almost unbelievable, a testament to the discipline they'd maintained. Warner immediately radioed Tonga with the shocking news that he had found 6 boys alive on Ada, claiming they were runaways from a boarding school. On the other end of the radio transmission, there was stunned silence, then the sound of someone breaking down emotionally. The radio operator's voice reportedly cracked and wavered as he processed the impossible news. These boys had been given up for dead over a year ago. Their families had held funerals. If this was really true, if these were actually those same 6 boys, it was nothing short of a miracle. Warner brought them back to Tongatapu, where relief and joy should have been the end of their incredible story. But it wasn't. Mr. Taniela Uhila, the fisherman whose boat they had stolen, hadn't forgotten and hadn't forgiven. The law is often far more interested in categories and rules than in context or circumstances, and theft was theft, regardless of what happened afterward. The boys were arrested as soon as they landed and thrown into prison. Warner, confronted with the absolute absurdity of punishing boys who had survived 15 months on an uninhabited island through extraordinary courage and cooperation, decided to personally intervene. He devised a practical plan. He would help produce a documentary film about their incredible survival story and use the proceeds to pay Mr. Uhila for his stolen boat. Warner paid the debt in full. The boys were released from prison. Families were finally reunited. Parents held sons they had already buried in their hearts and minds. Doctors examined the boys and were absolutely astonished, not just that they were alive and relatively healthy, but that Stephen's broken leg, set on a cliff-bound island with nothing but branches and faith, had healed almost perfectly with full function and just a thin scar as evidence of the injury. It was a small medical miracle produced not by advanced technology or trained surgeons, but by simple care, patience, and teamwork. Only a few weeks after their dramatic rescue, the boys returned to Ada with Peter Warner and a film crew to document their story. The island that had nearly killed them had also, in a strange and profound way, raised them into something stronger. The documentary they filmed aired on Australian television in 1966, and Peter Warner was celebrated as a genuine hero. He received exclusive fishing rights in Tongan waters directly from King Tufahautupu IV, an official royal reward for an act of curiosity and compassion that began with noticing scorch marks on a distant cliff. The years scattered the 6 boys across the map like seeds carried by wind. Kolo passed away in 2017 at the age of 71. The others built lives for themselves overseas in Australia, the United States, and New Zealand, carrying with them a story that sounds like pure myth or exaggerated legend, but has the stubborn, verified texture of historical fact. Kolo kept that original coconut shell guitar he'd built, preserving it as a physical reminder of their time on the island. The song they wrote on Ada never vanished into obscurity. It endured like a footprint preserved in stone, passed down and remembered. Ada itself remains uninhabited to this day. The island's original residents were violently torn away by slave traders, and the land never fully recovered its population or its community. The boys, in their documentary interviews, expressed a sincere hope that one day Tongans might return and repopulate Ada, not as stranded castaways drinking seabird blood to survive, but as a thriving community choosing to live there again, reclaiming the island's tragic history and transforming it into something new. For now, decades later, that hope hasn't become reality. The cliffs still stand tall and forbidding. The ruins still slowly weather under sun and rain. The island waits, completely indifferent and infinitely patient, the way islands always do. And that's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the absolute center of this remarkable story. The boys weren't saved by becoming savage beasts who fought each other for scraps. They were saved by actively refusing to become that. They made rules and structure when absolutely no one was forcing them to. They tenderly cared for the injured instead of abandoning them. They separated and cooled down when angry rather than letting conflicts escalate into violence. They worked in pairs so no one faced challenges alone. They exercised their bodies, they sang songs together, they kept a single fire burning for months and months without letting it die once. Not because it was romantic or noble, but because they understood at a fundamental level that survival is rarely one single heroic act. Survival is the unglamorous decision, repeated daily to do the boring, necessary thing. Gather water even when you're exhausted. Feed the flame even when your hands are bleeding. Check on your friend even when you're struggling yourself. Keep your hands and mind busy so your thoughts don't turn dark and self-destructive. If you're looking for a simple moral to this story, the obvious one is that humans are better than we fear, more capable of cooperation and decency than we give ourselves credit for. But the deeper lesson might be harder to swallow and more challenging to accept. We are not automatically doomed to descend into savagery under pressure, but we're also not guaranteed to maintain our decency and humanity. What we become in extreme situations depends entirely on what we actively choose to build when no one is watching or judging us, what rules we decide to invent and follow, what responsibilities we choose to accept even when we could easily abandon them, what stories we tell ourselves in the dark when the ocean is still roaring beyond the rocks and hope feels impossibly distant. On Ada, 6 boys made the choice, again and again, day after day for over a year, to build a small functioning civilization out of almost nothing. They created order from chaos, community from isolation, hope from despair. And that real story, more than any fictional island bloodbath or dystopian fantasy, is what should genuinely make us stop and stare and wonder at what humans are capable of when we choose cooperation over conflict. If you found this true story as powerful and mind-blowing as we did, do us a solid and smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this. And if you're into true stories that completely challenge what we think we know about survival, human behavior, and that razor-thin edge between order and total chaos, hit that subscribe button right now because we've got so many more incredible stories waiting to be told. Tell us in the comments which part of their survival story you found the most dangerous and challenging. Was it the 8 days drifting without water, the months trying to create fire, Stephen's broken leg on those deadly cliffs, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts below.